Good afternoon. Welcome to Big Conversations with Tia DMO. In today's Big Conversation, we have Edmonton's Councillor for Ward sipiwiyiniwak, Sarah Hamilton. She joins us for conversation. Hello, Sarah. Thank you so very much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I want to say I'm really sorry about what happened at City Hall last Tuesday, the Tuesday before the last, and how are people feeling generally about things right now?
I think it really depends on the person. For some context, after the active shooter incident happened, meetings for the rest of the week were canceled, and then meetings last week were canceled. And this was in part to allow people who were affected, because everyone's affected differently. And I'll note that thankfully nobody was physically harmed, but it allowed for people who were affected to take a moment and get the support that they needed before we carry on with city business. It's really important, first and foremost, to uh, take care of our staff and make sure that people are have the support that they need.
Absolutely. So the city has been engaging in like a security audit. Do you know what the outcomes of that audit is?
We haven't. We haven't been briefed on what the outcomes of that security audit will be, but um, I would expect it, to look at balancing public access to the space of City Hall. You've been in it. It's a lovely, warm, and welcoming space, but to balance that against the needed sort of security enhancements. About, I want to say in about 2017, there was a recommendation for City Hall to improve some of its security. I wasn't part of that discussion at the time. I wasn't on council yet, but I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those recommendations come back.
Absolutely. I'm just wondering, would you say that City Hall is a safe place to work?
I think it is. And I know that there's probably people in the last couple of weeks who feel that it's not. But for the last 30 years or so, City Hall has been a safe place to work. And if you walk through there on an ordinary day, you, as an elected official, you would see people uh, sitting at a table, having coffee with friends, reading in the city room, playing the piano. Now, that's been my experience, lots of people around, it being a inviting place. But I also know that sometimes, obviously being a civic building, it has attracted people who have a grievance with either the city councillor or the mayor, and it has made staff feel unsafe. And I think that over the years, there's been some enhancements made. For instance, limiting access to front of house staff, people who are talking to residents, just so that um, people can take lunch breaks and not worry about being alone and stuff like that. So, but it is important that people, not just me, but that folks who are working in that space do feel it's safe. So I I have felt it safe. I think it will be safe in future, but again, taking care of the concerns and being mindful of the experience people have had is really important.
Talking about concerns, what sort of concerns have you heard that people like your staff and other people who work at City Hall have about resuming? Because my understanding is it's going to be open in some sort of capacity this week.
Yeah, so City Hall will be opening. I think that a public notice went out. It'll be opening to people for whom that's a primary workspace. Monday at 7 a.m. But that means you need a city ID, and your office has to be in the building essentially, or your workspace has to be in the building. And I think this is a good first step in terms of helping employees feel safe in the workspace first, and then having that second stage conversation about what reopening to the public looks like and what security enhancements might be in place.
I mean, as a public officer, do you feel that your own personal safety is being threatened? I was speaking to another councillor, and she said you guys have to fill a form, some sort of disclosure that lists the names of your children, your partner. Do you sometimes feel, or have you ever felt open that your personal details are out there? Do you feel safe with this new development with the active shooter incident?
I do, and so what I'll say about that security document is that it's not my understanding is that is not sort of out there. It's not like in a computer somewhere that someone could find, that it's kept under close, it's essentially kept locked up.
I thought there was a public document, some sort of disclosure transparency document we have to list family members. Okay, maybe
so there's a couple of things. One is you have to so under the MGA, you have to publicly disclose sort of what companies you have an interest in, and who your family members are, and what companies they might have an interest in. But I am not I don't know that that's available to the public. That may only be available to municipal affairs. I've certainly never, it's not sort of readily available. So that's one thing. It's a sort of financial disclosure piece that discloses any fiduciary or fiduciary conflicts we may have. And then there's a security form essentially that you get asked to fill out that does have the names of your family and like where your kids go to school and stuff like that. And that I understand is kept that's not sort of uploaded anywhere. That's just kept pretty tight for obvious reasons. It's deeply personal.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worrisome if it would be worrisome if the public had access to that document.
Yeah.
So you first became a councillor, Sarah, in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
This is 2023. Let's talk about some of the lessons you've learned along the way. What are some poignant lessons you've learned since 17?
That's a really good question. That was, I think that was also a different council. When I was elected to council, the only other woman I served with was, I think, someone you know, Bev Esslinger, who was a great mentor and friend to me. We still keep in touch. I always love hearing from her, and she continues the work of championing women in local government, which I think is so important. I think it takes a long time. I'll say first and foremost that being in public eye, even as somebody who worked in politics before I got elected, suddenly being in the public eye and people knowing your name, there's different expectations placed upon you, and that can feel tremendous at some point, and very much like you're disappointing people, and that can take some time to grow into until you feel comfortable sort of with the decision you're making and explaining sort of how you're making a decision, and knowing that you're not going to make everyone happy. I mean, this is going back a number of years, but people were, if you're going back to the masking debates of summer 2021, people were totally okay with saying absolutely horrific things about some of my colleagues and I, and it didn't matter which side of the debate you're on. That may have bothered me a lot in my first years on council. By the end of the first term, I knew that we were making the right decision, and I felt really comfortable with it. It was more just disappointing to see how people let a decision like that fracture their relationships with each other and fracture communities. And And I think that that sense of self and a sense of your own mind is hard won. And I really value it because it's also allowed me to hear people better. It's allowed me to engage with people more sincerely and authentically, because when their opinions are different than mine, and a lot of people's opinions are different than mine, it's not a threat. I can see, empathize, I can understand, and not have to take that on. And that also makes me, I think, a better governor, because it leaves my mind open to persuasion. So, I'm listing sort of a number of things here, but being open to persuasion is so important as an elected official. Being open to the multitude of perspectives of the people that you represent, and also being able to clearly articulate how and why you made a decision, and refer back to some of those conversations, I think, makes you better at your job.
So what I'm hearing is you've matured through this role.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. You've learned, you've grown, and also that you're a team player. That is what I am picking up. Now, I've got about 2 questions to ask you here. So would you say we're coming towards the end of your second term, which ends like 2025? Would you say that you have accomplished, like, say, everything within your heart, given the second time opportunity to do it? Would you be needing a third term to finish up, or let's just start there. Do you get the question though?
It's too early to say if I'm gonna go for a third term at all. But I think I'll say I crafted my desire to run again around some of the things I felt we didn't accomplish in the last term. And that was things like ensuring that we had a really good baseline of financial support for core services. Well, I don't, that's not something that I've ended up being able to champion this term. I don't think that we've gone far from that. I think if you look at something, and this is very glamorous on a -3-degree snowless day in February, but snow removal is something that is an evergreen issue in our city. But because we council endorsed an administrative proposal to essentially not just increase snow removal funding, but to understand the correlation between that funding and the level of service that residents receive, I think we've got a really good sort of future plan for how we're going to support core services and how much it costs us as a city to deliver on those. Other things that I've been passionate about and continue to work on are things like the Big Island Provincial Park issue, which is a collaboration with between the city, Enoch Cree First Nation, and the provincial government. That's something that precedes my time on council. Big Island will be in Ward sipiwiyiniwak, and I think would, could, and should be a fantastic asset, not just for Edmonton, but for Alberta.
So Sarah, what would you classify with this present council? I know it's up next year, 25. What would you count as key achievements with this council?
Of this council, I would note that there's been a substantial investment in climate resilience infrastructure. There has been, I'm going to say, a foregrounding of issues around anti-racism and around reconciliation. I think those were previous priorities for the first council I served on. But I think that this council has sort of continued that work. I think the big one that Edmontonians may have heard a little bit about, and that we'll probably see a lot more of in the coming years, in sort of the last few, during the last term, we approved something called the City Plan, and that outlined what the development structure of our city was going to look like going forward to a population of 2 million. So instead of the city built, only building for the next 10 years, this is a notional idea that we're building to 2 million people, so doubling the population of Edmonton. Following on that, this past term, we approved, so far we've approved a zoning bylaw renewal. So we allow more flexibility, which it supports the city plan. What that means is that ideally we will see more housing be developed. We'll see less restrictions in terms of the development of housing, and the type of housing can be built. It's sort of a wider breadth, so it can be tailored, I'll say, to better suit the needs of the neighborhood. And I'm hoping that we get more creative, diverse, and suitable built forms out of that, that allow us to some of the uses, allow coffee shops to go in neighborhoods. In a lot of developed neighborhoods now, there's very little commercial that people in their neighborhood have access to. So it means that they almost have to get in a car in order to get something to eat, have a coffee, or even socialize outside of their home. That kind of change in our city, I think, could be a really positive thing. On the flip side, I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that that people grieve change. And that includes us as well, right? Our neighborhoods change, and we worry that as that change happens, we'll lose the things that made that place special. I think we can't lose sight, as leaders, we can't lose sight of the fact that building strong communities mean bringing people along with empathy and understanding.
I mean, thank you, Sarah. You said a lot in that. I was just wondering about anti-racism. I know
Sure.
the city has prioritized this, obviously, with a visible minority mayor himself. I'm just wondering, though, if your anti-racism initiatives have gone far enough. So when you look at what you've done already, could you talk us right through what far enough will look like? Because you and I know we're not there yet.
No, and I think you'd probably agree that anti-racism is a whole of society issue. So it's a whole of we need a whole society approach. I don't accept the notion that at the municipal level we can't change anything, so we may as well not do anything. I think there's a lot of things we can do. I think, for instance, so there is an anti-racism strategy, and the city manager's in the process of starting an anti-racism body that can also sort of consult or advise, not just within the city, but outside of the city organization, into the community, how to I guess fit the anti-racist lens over the work that people are doing. And I think we saw over the last few years, organizations often internally don't have the capacity to ask those hard questions or lead those difficult discussions. So I think that's a way that the mandate of anti-racism is serving the community. I think that there's everything from looking at the language that we use within the city to looking at laws, bylaws, and zones, for instance, that might unintentionally or perhaps intentionally, because we know that structures can be intentionally racist. So looking at those, looking at the city through city government, I should say, through that anti-racist lens. I don't know, I'll challenge you on, I guess, the notion of far enough here, because I do think that we're working with as much capacity as we can to move the file forward. in terms of where our staff are, and then also trying to, I think, match the needs in community. However, having been on council now for 6 years, this conversation looked and sounded a lot different 6 years ago. And looking back at those decisions, and the process that we used to make them, now I can see how far we've come, because I see how we would change our approach to it. And so, I guess reflecting on it, it's not, to me, it's not whether or not we can go, we have farther to go. I think we know that we can go further, but we, to an extent, have to allow ourselves to grow as we go, because we also made missteps along the way. We also unintentionally harmed people along the way, and I think we're trying to repair some of that. We're trying to repair relationships as we develop our understanding as an organization, as council, about what our role in anti-race, as being active anti-racists is.
It's fine, Sarah. I want to explore who you may have hurt in this work, but I want to ask a question in terms of you challenging me on whether or not your council has gone far enough. And I get that no matter what you do, many people will still say, oh, wish they could have done this or done that. So, but yeah, two areas I want to ask you to consider with me. Can you talk to us, if at all, there's anything called affirmative action when it comes to recruitment or about jobs at the City of Edmonton in terms of anti-racism? Because that is one part of, I believe, okay, so the city council itself, the city itself, administration-wide, is a bit more diverse because of the work, and I'm just wondering, in terms, are jobs a bit more affirmative in terms of favoring anti-racism? And secondly, the City of Edmonton, my understanding is it's divided into groups: Edmonton Heritage Council, Edmonton this, Edmonton that. So you got grants and funds everywhere. Perhaps there's a one-stop shop. People can go, okay, grants for women, grants for this, grants for that, to make the whole thing probably seamless or stress. Would you know of any? Or maybe there is, and I just don't know.
That's a really good question. I might have to get back to you about that, because I would agree that the organizational structure of government can make it really hard to find grants. And 6 years in, I think that I know all the places to go, and someone will surprise me with something. So I will look and see if there's sort of a one-stop shop, especially as it relates to, I'm going to say, those community grants that allow community groups access to funds. I can't comment too much on hiring practices. There is no formal affirmative action like policy, to my knowledge. But I will also say that the city organization is really, some of the complexities that we forget is, in addition to, I'm going to say, the application process. Sarah Hamilton, not a councillor, put my resume in. If I'm internal to the city and in scope, as in I belong to a union, then that application is treated differently than if I, as an external applicant, am applying to the city. And this is because there's seniority often written into collective agreements. Now, what that looks like, in the hiring process, I couldn't say, but I would say that, even with my own understanding, I think it's a much more complex process. But I will also say that in the past, when I've had people who are curious about working for the city and wanted to understand the hiring process and the application process. The folks who work in human resources have always been really receptive to talking to people about what it means for working for the city. I've heard this critique, this criticism of the city that you're talking about before. I've actually heard it about all of government, that it's not super clear and understandable how someone gets a job. And they seem like pretty good jobs from the outside, and you get to, I think, do good work. So I can understand how people would want that process to be fair and transparent. So I would say, and I'm cautious to volunteer just our HR department, but it's always worth, if you're applying for a job or curious, to call the HR folks and or email folks and ask questions, and understand more about the workplace that you're going into. So.
Hey, Sarah, thank you for that. We're running out of time, so I got to move things up real quickly from here. You mentioned that we might have voted one or two people during anti-racism. I'm just curious here because I got a curious mind, maybe a nosy mind. You say, who might this work have injured?
I think so. I know that sometimes when we're having conversations around anti-racism, you know, I think we have to, I can't speak to specific sort of circumstances, but we, I think, have to be mindful to make space for people's personal experiences and to allow them the opportunity to not participate in a discussion if it's too much, to give that I'm going to say the breathing room, and having a really good I say conflict management, but a way to address disagreements, because I think, and I'm by no means an expert in anti-racism, you're oftentimes working with people who are bringing their own experiences, who are bringing their own sometimes trauma, sometimes hopes to a conversation, and that can collide with other people's trauma and their hopes. And having, I think, a really good I don't think we council 6 years ago necessarily thought about how do we make sure that this is a psychologically safe conversation for folks. I don't know that we thought about sort of the pressure it could put people under within their own communities and the larger community to be the quote unquote sole representative of a community in a conversation. And so I think that, that's something that we don't do anymore. But in the past, you may have practiced sort of looking for people from specific communities and not given them permission to overtly, I should say, not represent sort of the whole of the community, because that's not fair. I don't represent all. Well, I do represent West Edmonton, obviously, but there's lots of people who would not feel represented by me through an identity, and lots of people who look for that representation elsewhere otherwise. Yeah, I don't know if that's super clear.
I get you. I hear what you're saying, and it's interesting to hear from your point of view, because sitting here, I ordinarily won't see it that way, but I understand what you're saying perfectly well, and I'm sure our audience will too. So thank you for that. I've got,
maybe. Sorry, I was going to say, maybe a crisper way of saying it is that we often assume people to be gatekeepers, and that is not an anti-racist lens. That sort of reinforces power structures, and that's a way politics has been done well before I arrived in politics, but it's not something that I've ever been comfortable with, and it's something that I think does more harm to communities than good. So that's a really good example. And a gatekeeper is like when I go to one person and I say, you, this one person from one community, you're going to represent 500 or 1,000 or 1,200 or 5,000 people. And that puts a lot of pressure on them. And I don't get the diversity of perspectives within a certain ethnic or religious community. This happens a lot. So,
Okay.
and it's a practice in politics and government we have to stop.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you. I got a question here on housing. Are we going to see permanent housing solutions anytime soon?
I think this is a really complex issue. I think we have different, so I'll say that in the realm of housing issues that we have in Edmonton, we have a need for more housing because we are growing. I look at, and we have the land to grow housing on, I'll say that. Some of the housing needs include housing for multifamily or intergenerational families, I should say. So some families need, I'll say, below market housing that has a lot of bedrooms because there's more, there's not a lot of children, but there's more than say 2 children. And so the market doesn't have a lot of options for people who need below market housing and have an intergenerational household and more than 2 children. So like looking for 4, 5, and 6 bedroom accommodation is incredibly challenging, and the waiting list for that is really long. Conversely, there are people who need a lot of support in their housing. We might call those people hard to house, and there's a multitude of potential options for them. But I think in terms of talking about housing issues, we need to disaggregate what all the housing issues are. And so I think Edmonton is I don't know if we will get there. And this is why, because Edmonton is in a really unique position now, where if we start building like today, we can accommodate the population growth that we will see over the next 20 to 30 years. But if we get behind on that, then we are going to be looking at, I think, a housing issue commensurate to an extent with what we see in other Canadian municipalities. Edmonton has a lot of promise in terms of our post-secondary institutions, in terms of our job market growth and our affordable cost of living. If we can't build housing fast enough, it will erode the cost of living and it will erode our ability to attract that talent. Housing is an economic development strategy. We also so that's sort of the larger thing. Building housing that accommodates below market housing that accommodates intergenerational families is really important to addressing a major housing challenge, I think, for a lot of families in Edmonton. Addressing the housing challenges with people who are hard to house is also, I think, something that we need to figure out. But I think that all comes under an umbrella of getting things under construction, getting things going. The individual, sort of the tailored solutions for some of those challenges are a little bit different. But I think generally speaking, if we're not building housing in Edmonton, we're going to fall behind on whatever the challenges ahead of us are. I think that's the blunt way of putting it. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Why are we not building? Sorry about that.
Sorry?
Why are we not building?
I think so. There's a number of reasons that there's some buildings that are being built. I think that we have to know that when it comes to building, we are building a lot when it comes to single detached or some greenfield. So you go to the edges of the city in the south or the west southwest where I represent, in the southeast, ward around Ward Spomatapi, in the northeast, for instance, around Ward Dene, that they're building in greenfield. But I think we also need to see housing, as our city plan says, we need to see construction of housing along transportation routes, which means infill housing around the LRT, that transit-oriented development, and certainly in the core where there is already a lot of services. One of the challenges I've heard is that as we, it's the talk of the last 2 years. We've seen inflationary cost pressures. We've seen interest rates go up, and we've seen challenges with labor. We've seen labor shortages. So combine that all, it's really hard to get a major project approved through the banks. Oftentimes, people like developers of these big projects will have to borrow money. And they have to borrow it from one of the banks. And you look at a market like Vancouver or Toronto where you see really huge returns, and you look at a market like Edmonton where you might see incremental returns or even flat returns for the foreseeable future. So it can be, and we have seen a jump in, so that's for purchasing. On the flip side, for rentals, we have seen a bit of a jump in rent, but we also know we have a cap on that. There's no $5,000 apartment rentals, or there's very few $5,000. There's not a big market for $5,000 apartment rentals in Edmonton right now. So that sort of environment can make it really hard to build new housing. What is our role as a municipal government? It's, I think, understanding that problem. I think it's working with our intergovernmental colleagues to address that, either through some incentives. If we want, in 2021, we did something called the Downtown Development Incentive, which essentially stayed property taxes for 5 to 7 years in the downtown if you're building 50 or more residential units. So on the balance of somebody not going into the ground and starting construction, we have at least 5, I think, buildings under construction in the residential buildings under construction in the downtown that includes, affordable housing components. That kind of grant system, I think, is successful because it can be a benefit to developers who are trying to get projects off the ground. But I think we have to be really vocal. I think we have to advocate with the financial decision makers in this country. Oftentimes these financial decisions are made far and away from Edmonton and Alberta. They're made in Eastern or Central Canada. And it is to our benefit to have a presence in those conversations and to make the case of why investing in a city like Edmonton is good for the rest of the country.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a detailed answer. We've run out of time now, and I got a final question. What do you do for your mental health, and what gives you hope for the future?
Well, my son just ran into the room. So it's a good segue because he gives me hope for the future. And for my mental health, I'm a big reader. When we're on recess, I really like to dive into fiction and nonfiction books. I exercise a lot. I listen to music. I get out into our stunning river valley It can feel sometimes when you're on city council like the challenges we face as a city are all around you and they're insurmountable. But getting out into the city and talking to people and experiencing like the wonderful quality of life the city has to offer puts those problems and challenges, I think, into perspective. And I find it really inspiring. It gives me a lot of strength and gives me, I see whether it's my son who's 2.5 or you know, the young people at City Hall School, the kids give me hope for the future. They're so smart. They're so smart.
That's the most beautiful thing I've heard today. So Sarah Hamilton, thank you so very much for spending premium time on a Sunday afternoon talking to us about the work you do and about Edmonton. Please
Thank
enjoy
you.
the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye. So thank you so very much for listening to our conversation with Councillor Hamilton. We hope you join us next time. Please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.